We welcome you back to the Weekend Research Project. We welcome our colleague, Jonathan Shear. John, last week you stated that Republicans have a demographic problem with minorities, and we got into it. Is there anything I said in the first segment that you disagree with?
Well, I think, I guess I had more of a question of where, because I know in the article you kind of talk about the Dixiecrats, and you kind of skip over, well, where did the Dixiecrats go, is my question.
They died.
They died?
Yeah, they were around the 40s. They were mostly dead now. They were 40 years old in the 40s. They're mostly dead now.
Because the question I had is, when I look at, I know how we had the 1960 election. Kennedy was in favor of civil rights at the time. He ran.
No, Johnson was an absolute segregationist, is what I mean.
Well, maybe Johnson was, but I know Kennedy made it a priority. It was his agenda that Johnson carried out later on.
He picked a segregationist.
Well, I don't know about that. But you had Kennedy, and then you had a split. You basically had a split with the party.
Right.
You had the segregation because the Democrats in the South were. I'm not going to debate that they were part of the New Deal coalition, the segregationists, Southern Democrats. But then you have Barry Goldwater, who comes in 1964.
Right.
He runs his election. He rebukes the 1964 Civil Rights Act.
Right, he was against it.
He's against it, although he was a member of the NAACP before that, because I'm not debating either that the Republican Party was correct on race relations until about that time. But then you have 1964, he runs on a states' rights platform.
Right.
He rebukes the Civil Rights Act, and he picks up Mississippi, Louisiana, Alabama, South Carolina,
Georgia,
and
Arizona.
And Arizona. And for the first time since Reconstruction. So I'm wondering, is that just a mere coincidence that we have somebody who runs on states' rights, which was the same argument that they used during the Civil War to say, against Northern interference in their affairs, the same argument that the segregationists and the Dixiecrats used. States' rights don't interfere, even when the governor of Arkansas said, don't integrate our schools, states' rights issue. So Barry Goldwater runs on that. Okay. He wins those states the first time. Then you have, and then after that, that's like, to me, looking at the electoral map, that's a pivotal year. Because after 1964, you see the South progressively goes from Democrat to Republican. So.
Right, well, can I explain that? Okay, so the 1920s was when the Republicans started winning parts of the South. The South is not a unitary, not one place. One, Texas is not the South, Texas is Texas. If you talk to a Southerner, they'll say, well, I'm not going to the South, I'm going to Texas. Texas is an independent place. Tennessee, Virginia, North Carolina, that's the outer South. Republicans have started winning those states in the outer South. In the 20s, Eisenhower won almost every one of those states, including the Deep South in the 50s.
Well, Eisenhower could have gone either way. He was a popular figure.
Okay, but Eisenhower did win in the South in the 50s, way before that. The 64 Act, you remember, okay, the reason Johnson had such a large sweep over the entire nation, won 44 states, second most on the Democrat besides FDR, was because in 64, there was a mass fear of a nuclear war. That was it. He had the famous Daisy commercial of a little girl picking flowers and counting, and then a nuclear bomb. Well, it was one of them. Anyway, so there was a giant fear of that, and he opposed the 64 Civil Rights Act, not because he was against civil rights, because he desegregated his military unit when he was in the military. He desegregated, he was in part of the NAACP. He desegregated anything that when he was a part of it and in a leadership position. He was against it because he did not believe the government had the right to tell businesses and homeowners who they could and could not sell their businesses to. That was solely his thing, because 1964 Civil Rights Act was not the first Civil Rights Act. There was rights all throughout the 40s, all throughout the 50s. Al Gore's father was a super segregationist. Almost all the Southern Democrats were segregationists. Most Democrats, most other populist Democrats were segregationists. Throughout all of those bills, and it was Republicans who fought for them time in and time out. And if you remember, Kennedy did very little in actual legislation to uphold the Civil Rights Act. Thurgood Marshall, who later on became the Supreme Court Justice, he was fighting a lawsuit. Had Nixon beat Kennedy in 1960, there would have been a greater advance in civil rights than had Kennedy won. Kennedy really held back on it, and it was in '64 when Johnson won and he was proposing the Civil Rights Act. He made a point in there noticing the demographics of Dixiecrats dying, and their children were not at the same level of segregation that their parents had been. The people, when Reagan ran, for example, in 1976, when Reagan ran in the Republican primary, Reagan, they asked to run in '64. When Reagan ran in '76 and lost to Ford, the only place in the South that he was winning was amongst college kids. And he was totally anti-segregationist because there was a.
Well, he painted Ford as being an establishment person in favor of forced integration, from what I understand.
Right. Well, there was a lot of, Republicans, Richard Nixon was a forced integrationist because they had given it 30 years to try to integrate it naturally and it didn't work. And at that point he said, we're going to force it upon you. Certainly Goldwater's attack of the 1964 Civil Rights Act for completely different reasons, because of constitutional reasons, was the reason he had a lot of appeal in the South. But also, Goldwater ran a terrible campaign. At his own speech, he said extremism is good. And
well, yeah,
as much as people
may won those states,
as much as people may love that, it's not a popular thing to say as a presidential candidate. So he and he ran a very bad campaign. The biggest highlight of his entire campaign was Ronald Reagan's big television ad, which was A Time for Choosing, which everyone said, this is our man for the future. And even they said he was too extreme.
But the very fact that he opposed the Civil Rights Act,
of '64, he has voted for all of them.
But that was the one that was the major concern for minorities. If I'm a minority, and here you have somebody who's in favor of a law that says you can't discriminate based on race in businesses and anything, and then you have somebody else who's saying no, isn't that going to lead you naturally to the Democratic Party?
No.
Why would a minority want to vote for? They're not going to easily forget.
Well, Republicans proposed the Voting Rights Act. They got the Voting Rights Act. They got the 1950, the 1952, the 1940. I wrote them all throughout my article.
Martin Luther King.
Right. No, that was afterwards.
But that's another thing. You say
it was a bipartisan bill.
Well, bipartisan hardly, because he initially opposed it, but then there was a supermajority in the Senate and the House. And then, only then did he actually...
Right, the black Republican from Massachusetts senator was the senator who pushed it to the Senate. But previous to that, Republicans had been proposing Civil Rights Act all through the 50s, Thurgood Marshall, winning major civil rights cases. And the 1964 Civil Rights Act is the most famous Civil Rights Act, not because it was the best, not because it was constitutional, but because the Democrats made it the most famous. Certainly the 1950-52 Civil Rights Act did much more in advancing black children into getting into public schools, into getting into, they did do forced busing, which is bad, and the end
it was the most comprehensive, it was the most far-reaching, because as long as you can have segregation,
right, and that was an Eisenhower.
As long as you can have it in private accommodations, it was basically, parents could pull their kids out of public schools and put them in segregated private schools. The reason the 1964 Act is the most famous is because, and the most far, is because it's the most far-reaching. I would argue, but I'm not arguing that Republicans were in support of it before '64. But after '64, you see I would argue, you see a major shift. When you get to Reagan, for example, Reagan decides to announce his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi.
That is a major. I'm glad you brought that up. That is a major falsehood of history. Reagan in '80, when Reagan announced his thing, his first announcement was not in Philadelphia or in Mississippi. It was in New Jersey and in New York, because he had to overlook the Statue of Liberty. That's where he did it. What happened was Carter said that it wasn't Philadelphia, and the media made it. Carter announced his 1980 campaign in the home of a KKK member. That's the difference. Carter was from Georgia. Reagan did not do that. That is a misquote of history, and some lies are.
Well, misquote of history. I found it in every single credible news source.
You can easily. You can easily look up that Reagan did.
Even if it's not the first one, you go to Philadelphia, Mississippi, and you make a speech about states' rights in a place where 3 people were murdered in the Civil Rights era, using the same argument that the segregationists used, the same argument that Barry Goldwater used, and now you're using the same argument playing to an all-white crowd at a county fair. What's the natural inclination? That's a coincidence?
Well, The problem is that states' rights went from being viewed as, states' rights was an overwhelmingly, the history of states' rights has been an overwhelmingly pro-minority movement, is the movement of states' rights. You have to remember that the first States' Rights Act, the first secessionist movement was actually in the 1700s when they were trying to get, 1800s when New England and Massachusetts wanted to secede because of the 1812 war. But the biggest States' Rights Act was when they would not let the slaves go back to the South. That was a huge States' Rights Act. The federal government said you have to return runaway slaves back to the South. And Wisconsin, Minnesota was in the city, but Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, New York said no, we're not doing that. That was an act of opposing federal legislation to states' rights. You have to remember the federal government. As much as blacks view the federal government as an area of good for black people, because now that they've hooked them all on welfare and then locked them up in the drug war, they
well, I think that's a misnomer.
but no, that's what happened. But before that, the federal government had the Tuskegee Project. The federal government was playing with black people and giving them STDs to see what would happen with it. The federal government was using blacks for a myriad of things, and that is why states' rights was overwhelmingly positively viewed by blacks. And it has been a 50, 60-year project to change the issue of states' rights from a positive thing to a negative thing, because they bring up the South. Well, there were as many positive things going on in the North in the name of states' rights as there were negative.
Yeah, but Reagan wasn't talking about those.
We're actually running out of time. I actually just wanted to ask you your opinion on something. The African American unemployment rate was 13.6 in February of 2009, right after Barack Obama was elected. It was 14% in July of 2009, when a president typically gets credit when their administration starts. It peaked at 16.2% in August of 2010. The Latino unemployment is 10.2% in September. The unemployment has only gone up under the Obama administration. I would like you to answer to me why African Americans have voted 93% for Barack Obama.
Because Republican policies do not help minorities. Look at, for example, here, I have some statistics of my own right here. Look, for example, healthcare, and this is 2009 statistics, and this is before Obama.
This is all right.
1 in 10 children is uninsured, the lowest in 20 years. 1 in 6 of them are Hispanic, 1 in 9 are black, compared to 1 in 14 that are white. Education, states spend 3 times more money per prisoner as they do per student. 84% of black 4th graders, 8th graders, and 12th graders. 80% of Hispanics are reading below grade level. For the environment.
How does
African Americans are 30% more likely to have asthma, and they're 68% more likely to live near.
Okay, but then if those statistics are true, I'm not saying they're not true, but if they are true, then blacks should love school choice, which is a Republican initiative started by Jeb Bush in Florida. Blacks should love initiatives like George W. Bush proposed in his faith-based initiatives to expand local health care. He made 2,000 more local health care branches for low-income people. The problem with Republicans is not that they have legislation that doesn't help black people, is that because they don't actually take the time out to go talk to and listen to black people. And it's much easier to propose a piece of legislation and say this is going to be good for you, just give me the credit later on, than it is to win over a heart and actually make the effort. And that is, I think, where the problem is with Republicans and black people. And I don't think your statistics are wrong, but Republican legislation has been done throughout the entire Bush administration. And Bush really, there was no better president for black people than George W. Bush.
But the problem
We'll be right back. We're going to continue this debate. Is that like